You're splitting a dinner check on a Friday night. 7 people, 1 table. And for the first time in 11 years of doing this exact ritual, you notice you're the one who pulls out a card before anyone asks. Not because you're generous tonight, because you've quietly done the math already. In the 4 seconds, it took the waiter to set the folder down. And you know the difference between what you make and what everyone else at this table makes is now large enough that $340 split evenly costs you nothing and costs someone else. Milo probably something real. Nobody says anything. Roan mentions the game highlights from earlier. Faye is telling a story about her landlord raising rent again, $75 this time, and you catch yourself doing a second calculation, comparing $75 to a number in your own life that wouldn't register as anything at all. You don't say this out loud. You've learned slowly that saying it out loud rarely goes the way you hope it will. This is not a story about becoming rich. It's a story about becoming the highest earner in a group of people who once made almost exactly what you made, and what happens to 5 friendships when one line on a shared graph quietly detaches from the other 4 and keeps climbing while nobody agrees to acknowledge it happened. 10 years earlier, there were 5 of you, fresh out of the same state school, scattered into a version of adulthood that looked nearly identical from every angle. Roan sold insurance out of a strip mall office. Faye taught middle school science. Milo worked retail management, promoted twice already, proud of it. Junie did marketing for a regional bank. You did accounts payable for a manufacturing company. $38,000 a year. A salary you remember specifically because it matched Faye's teaching contract almost to the dollar. And the 2 of you used to joke about it, comparing pay stubs over drinks like it was a competition. Neither of you could lose, because you were both losing it equally. Nobody in the group had savings worth mentioning. Nobody had a car that wasn't financed. You all lived in some version of the same apartment complex 2 years running. Different units, same beige carpet, same parking lot where you'd all sit on someone's tailgate on a Saturday night, because none of you could justify a bar tab 2 weekends in a row. The equality wasn't a value anyone chose. It was just the honest math of 5 people at the same starting line. And starting lines feel like friendship because nobody has to explain anything yet. The divergence began quietly, the way divergences usually do, with a decision that didn't feel like a decision at the time. Your company offered to pay for a certification, a supply chain analytics course that took 4 months of evening classes. Nobody else in the friend group even knew you were taking, because it didn't seem worth mentioning until it mattered. It mattered 18 months later, when a director position opened up 2 levels above where you were sitting, and you were the only internal candidate who had both the tenure and the credential the job description quietly required. The raise that came with it was $22,000, pushing your salary to $71,000 in a single jump, and you remember exactly where you were when you saw the offer letter. Sitting in your car in the same parking lot where you used to sit on tailgates with Roan and Milo, engine running, heater on, reading the number twice to make sure you weren't misreading a comma. You didn't tell the group that week. You told Faye first, privately, because she'd always been the one you trusted with numbers before they were fully real, and she was happy for you in a way that felt completely genuine, and also, underneath it, slightly rehearsed, like she was already practicing the version of this conversation she'd need for everyone else. For the first 2 years after the raise, almost nothing changed on the surface. You still drove the same Civic. You still lived in a 2-bedroom you split with a roommate, because the promotion felt fragile in a way you couldn't fully explain. Like admitting comfort too early might jinx the whole arrangement, but something had shifted underneath the visible layer. And it showed up first in small arithmetic nobody discussed directly. When the group planned a weekend trip to the coast, a $600 rental split 5 ways came out to $120 each, an amount that used to require real budgeting from everyone, and now, for you alone, barely registered. You paid your share without comment. You didn't offer to cover anyone else's. Not yet, because you hadn't yet learned that the offer itself changes a dynamic just as much as the money does. Milo's retail management job plateaued around this time, not through any failure of his own, but through the specific ceiling that exists in that industry, where the title can climb, but the pay rarely follows proportionally. He was making $44,000 4 years into a job that used to feel like a promising start, and every year the gap between his trajectory and yours widened by a number he could calculate, even if he never said it out loud. You noticed him getting quieter during conversations about work, deflecting questions about his job with a joke instead of an answer, and you recognized the deflection because you'd used a version of it yourself years earlier. Back when Faye's teaching salary had briefly outpaced your accounts payable job, and you'd felt the same small, embarrassing flinch. By the time you turned 31, the gap had widened into something structural rather than incidental. Your director role became a VP track 2 years later, pushing your salary past $140,000, plus a bonus structure that added another $18,000 to $25,000 most years, depending on quarterly performance. Junie, meanwhile, had left the bank for a nonprofit job she genuinely loved, taking a $9,000 pay cut to do work that felt meaningful, a trade she never regretted, but one that put even more distance between her number and yours. Distance she'd chosen willingly, and still occasionally winced at, when the group's conversations turned toward money. Roan's insurance career had its own strange shape. Some years excellent, commission-driven and occasionally spectacular. Other years brutal enough that he quietly borrowed $2,000 from his parents to cover a slow stretch, a fact you only learned secondhand months later, from Faye, who mentioned it the way people mention things they're not sure they were supposed to know. You didn't bring it up with Roan directly. You'd learned by then that money moving sideways through a friend group travels faster and more accurately as rumor than as direct conversation. The specific moment the group stopped pretending equality still existed happened at Faye's wedding. The summer you turned 33. The bachelorette weekend, planned by Junie, cost $850 per person for a beach house rental, flights, and 3 nights of dinners nobody had budgeted for, realistically. Milo went quiet in the group chat for 2 full days before finally admitting, in a message he clearly agonized over, that he couldn't swing it that month. Not with a car repair he hadn't planned for eating into the same paycheck. You offered to cover his share before anyone else could respond. A decision that took you 4 seconds and felt in the moment like the obviously correct thing to do. It was not received the way you expected. Milo said thank you, genuinely. But the thank you carried a weight underneath it that you didn't fully understand until weeks later. When Roan mentioned, half joking, that Milo had been embarrassed for a full week afterward, replaying the moment, wondering if everyone secretly knew he couldn't afford his own bachelorette weekend before you'd made it official by paying for it. Your generosity, meant privately, had become a fact the whole group now quietly held, and Milo's dignity had absorbed a cost you hadn't factored into the $850. This is the part almost nobody explains accurately about becoming the highest earner in a group of people who started level with you. It isn't really about the money changing hands. It's about the money changing what everyone assumes is possible for everyone else. Silently recalibrating who gets asked to chip in for what, who gets left off group plans because someone assumes incorrectly or correctly that the plan is now beneath you, and who starts performing a version of comfort they don't actually have because admitting otherwise in front of you specifically has started to feel like a different kind of exposure than it used to. Currently, researchers studying friendship dynamics across income divergence describe a pattern that shows up almost universally once income gaps exceed roughly 40 to 50% between people who consider themselves close peers. Spontaneous plans decrease, financial disclosure decreases, and the higher earner is quietly recast, often without any deliberate unkindness. From friend to resource. Nobody in your group would have described what was happening in those terms. It simply started looking, gradually like fewer last-minute dinner invitations extended to you on nights when the plan was a $12 pizza instead of a $60 tasting menu, an asymmetry so subtle you didn't notice it consciously for almost a year. The vacation planning conversations became their own quiet minefield. When the group tried to organize a 5-year reunion trip, the year you all turned 34, the destination debate split cleanly along income lines, nobody named directly. You suggested a resort in Mexico, $2,200 per person, including flights, a number that felt entirely reasonable from where you were standing. Milo went quiet again. Junie mentioned carefully that her nonprofit salary made that number a stretch. Roan didn't respond in the thread at all for 3 days, which everyone correctly interpreted as its own kind of answer. You backed off the suggestion immediately, embarrassed not by the cost itself, but by how easily you'd forgotten to check the number against anyone else's reality before proposing it as a starting point. The trip that eventually happened was a rented cabin 4 hours from home, $380 total for the group, a number you offered, gently, to cover disproportionately framing it as your treat for the reunion. Faye pulled you aside during that trip, on the porch on the second night, while everyone else was asleep, and told you something that stayed with you longer than almost anything else anyone said during those years. She said the group didn't need you to cover things. They needed you to stop making the cost of friendship something they had to manage around, even quietly, even kindly. She wasn't angry, she was tired. In the specific way people get tired of performing an ease around a subject that everyone privately knows isn't easy at all. You thought about that conversation for months afterward, turning it over the way you'd once turned over the offer letter in your car. What Faye had named, without quite naming it directly, was a mechanism you didn't yet have language for. The quiet tax that generosity places on a friendship where every kind gesture, however sincerely meant, also functions as a small, unavoidable reminder of the gap that made the gesture necessary in the first place. You couldn't undo the raise. You couldn't shrink the salary back down to match Milo's or Junie's for the sake of comfort. What you could change was how loudly the gap announced itself in ordinary moments, which meant, more often than felt natural, saying nothing at all, and letting people navigate their own version of the bill without your intervention. The real test of all of this arrived the year you turned 36, when Milo's mother was diagnosed with a condition requiring a treatment their insurance only partially covered, a gap of $14,000 that needed to be resolved within 2 months. Milo didn't ask you directly. He mentioned it in the group chat, the way people mention things when they're hoping someone will offer before they have to ask. A phrase you recognized instantly, because you'd watched it happen with Roan's parents years earlier and felt, at the time, like an outside observer to a dynamic you didn't yet fully understand your own role inside of. This time, you didn't offer immediately. You sat with it for 2 days, not out of hesitation about the money, which by then would barely have registered against your own accounts, but out of genuine uncertainty about what Faye had told you on that porch. You called Milo directly instead of responding in the group chat, and you asked him plainly what he actually needed, not performing generosity publicly, not making the group chat witness a rescue that would recast him, again, as the friend who couldn't cover his own life. He told you, quietly, that he needed $6,000, the rest he could manage through a payment plan the hospital had offered. You sent it that afternoon, structured as a gift, no repayment expected, no mention of it to anyone else in the group unless he chose to share it himself. He never did share it, not fully, and you never brought it up either. And this, more than the $850 bachelorette weekend years earlier, felt like the version of generosity that actually worked because it left his dignity intact in front of the only audience that mattered to him, which was never you specifically. It was Roan and Junie and Faye, the people whose opinion of his competence and independence he still needed to feel steady around, regardless of what you privately knew about his finances. Junie's situation revealed a different shape of the same problem 2 years later, when her nonprofit lost a major grant and cut her position entirely at 38, forcing her into 6 months of unemployment during a stretch when her savings, built on a salary that had never afforded much saving in the first place, ran dry after 11 weeks. She didn't ask for money at all. She asked, instead, if she could stay with you for a few weeks while she searched for something new, a request that felt smaller than the money itself, but revealed, more clearly than any dollar amount could have, how thoroughly her sense of independence had been shaped by never wanting to be the friend group's cautionary tale about financial vulnerability. You said yes without hesitation, and the 3 weeks she stayed turned into 5, during which you never once brought up money directly, letting her cover groceries when she felt able to, and covering them yourself. Quietly, on the weeks she couldn't, without ever making either version of the arrangement a topic of conversation. She found a new position eventually, a $6,000 pay cut from her old salary but stable. And when she moved into her new apartment, she brought you a bottle of wine that cost more than she could probably afford, a gesture you understood immediately as her way of settling an account that had never actually been open between you, at least not in the way she seemed to believe it was. Roan's arc took the longest to resolve, and, in some ways, never fully did. His commission-based income continued its volatile pattern into his 40s, good years funding a nice truck and a family vacation. Bad years requiring quiet loans from his parents that everyone in the group knew about and nobody discussed directly. The distance between his number and yours had grown, by then, into something almost abstract, difficult for either of you to discuss honestly because the scale had stopped feeling like a comparison and started feeling like two entirely different categories of financial life happening to two people who still somehow considered each other close friends. There was a specific dinner, the year you both turned 41, when Roan, after a few drinks, said something that neither of you ever fully addressed afterward. He said he sometimes wondered what would have happened if he'd taken that certification course instead of you, back when the company offered it to both of you and he'd turned it down because 4 months of evening classes felt like too much on top of his commission. Work at the time. You didn't know he'd been offered the same opportunity. He'd never mentioned it. In 11 years, until that exact moment, 3 drinks into a Friday night, and the revelation sat between you for a long, uncomfortable silence before the conversation moved on to something else. The way difficult truths often do among people who've decided, mostly unconsciously, that naming something fully would cost more than living alongside it quietly. You've thought about that dinner often in the years since, because it clarified something you'd been circling without quite landing on directly. The gap between you and your friends was never purely a function of talent or effort. The story people prefer to tell about income divergence because it flatters whoever ends up ahead. It was also, unavoidably, a function of timing, risk tolerance, which opportunities happened to land on which desk, and who had the specific, unglamorous willingness to sit through 4 months of evening classes when nothing about the outcome was guaranteed. Roan wasn't less capable. He'd simply made a different bet. At a moment when the difference between the two bets looked negligible, and 11 years of compounding had turned a small initial divergence into something that now looked, from the outside, like an entirely different life. By 43, the numbers, if anyone ever assembled them side by side, would have looked almost absurd next to the beige-carpet apartment complex where you'd all started. Your household income, combined with your spouse's, sat close to $310,000. Faye and her husband, both public school employees, brought in $124,000 combined. Milo recovered from his mother's medical crisis and promoted finally into a regional role, made $68,000. Junie, rebuilt after the layoff, earned $71,000 at a new nonprofit she loved even more than the first. Roan, in a strong year, might clear $95,000, in a weak one, closer to $60,000. You are, by any measure anyone in the group would eventually admit, if pressed, the highest earner by a wide and widening margin, and the strange discovery, arriving slowly over more than a decade, is that this fact changes almost nothing about who you actually are to each other, and almost everything about the mechanics of being together. Plans still happen. Dinners still happen. But you've learned to ask before suggesting a restaurant, to offer privately instead of publicly, to let people volunteer their own numbers, instead of assuming you already know what they can and can't afford. And hardest of all, to sometimes let a friend struggle with something you could easily fix, because fixing it uninvited would cost the friendship more than the problem itself ever could. The dinner where this story began, the one with the $340 check and the card you pulled out before anyone asked, ended differently than it started. Roan noticed. Eventually, the way you'd paid without comment, and said, quietly, almost to himself, that he appreciated you not making a thing of it. You told him the truth, which was that you'd learned, slowly and at some real cost, to all of your friendships along the way, that making a thing of it was almost always worse than the thing itself. What you've actually built over these 15 years since the certification course and the parking lot, and the offer letter you read twice to check the comma, isn't just a career or a net worth that would have seemed unimaginable to the version of you splitting a $38,000 salary's worth of groceries in a beige-carpet apartment. It's a specific, hard-won fluency in the particular etiquette of being financially ahead of people you genuinely love. An etiquette nobody teaches because nobody wants to admit the etiquette is necessary at all, as though acknowledging it might make the gap more real than pretending it doesn't exist. Faye still teaches. Milo still works retail, happily now having found a version of the ceiling he can live inside without resentment. Junie still does work. She loves for less money than she's worth by any market measure. Roan still rides the wave of commissions, good years and lean ones, and still, occasionally mentions the certification course he didn't take, though the mention has softened over the years into something closer to a private joke than an old wound. None of them have asked you for anything in the past 2 years. This, you've come to understand, is not distance. It's the specific, quiet dignity of 5 people who found a way to stay close despite a gap that could easily have pulled them apart. A gap none of you chose consciously, and none of you can fully undo. Managed now through 100 small, unspoken adjustments that took over a decade to learn, and will probably take the rest of your lives to keep practicing. Somewhere, in a group chat that still exists, still sends the same tired jokes and the same photos of someone's dog, there's a version of equality none of you have felt on paper in years, and all of you still, somehow, feel at the table. The check comes. You reach for it sometimes. Sometimes you don't, and let someone else split it evenly, the way you all used to, because equality was never really about the number. It was about being willing over and over to let the number matter less than the people sitting across from it.